From the glittering halls of Versailles to a freezing prison cell, Marie Antoinette's world collapsed under one of history's most violent storms, the French Revolution. The old regime was being torn apart, piece by piece. Privilege, monarchy, divine right, everything had to fall. And to build a new France, the revolution demanded blood. At the center of it all stood the Austrian-born queen, blamed for France's hunger, branded as a spy, and hated as the symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. But would royal blood truly be enough to satisfy the hunger of the revolution? This is true crime of the historical kind. You're listening to part 3 of the execution of Marie Antoinette. Heads will roll. If you missed part 1 and 2, make sure to go back and listen there first. What had once been the most powerful court in Europe was beginning to fracture under the pressure of economic crisis, political reform, and public rage. The old structures of power were being challenged in ways France had never seen before, whether out of desperation, radicalized ideas, or a movement that had spiraled out of control. Paris was the center of turmoil. And now the royal Bourbon family would be living right in the middle of it. After the Women's March on Versailles, Louis XVI agreed to relocate with his court to Paris, but in reality, he had little choice. For his wife, Marie Antoinette, hated as the Austrian queen and blamed for the nation's hunger, this forced move was the beginning of an unrelenting public humiliation. Now, the family found themselves in a journey that was not exactly a dignified royal procession. It was slow, tense, and deeply humiliating. Thousands of Parisians came to see the carriage make its way into the city as members of the National Guard rode alongside. Lafayette, in command, did his best to maintain order as crowds pressed around the convoy. Many of those walking beside the carriages were the same market women who had marched from Paris the day before. Some sang in triumph, believing that if the royal family lived in the city, they could be held responsible for feeding it. Some cheered. Now we have the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy. Inside the carriage sat Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their children, and the king's sister, Madame Elizabeth. For the queen, looking out at the droves of dirty, hungry people and the severed heads of royal bodyguards carried on pikes was terrifying. All she could do was sit in her seat, hoping to escape the glare and insults of an agitated swarm of people. It took nearly 6 hours. By the time the procession reached the Tuileries Palace, night had fallen. The Tuileries had stood largely unused for decades. Its rooms were drafty and ill-prepared for royal residency. The family entered cautiously, not knowing how to settle, while guards filled the courtyards and crowds lingered outside the gates. The king was still technically sovereign, but the royal family would now be living under what was effectively house arrest. Their movements restricted, their security dependent on revolutionary forces, and their lives constantly observed by a restless city brewing outside. From this moment forward, the monarchy, and especially Marie Antoinette, lived under the watchful and hostile eyes of Paris, never knowing who was friend or foe. But mostly foe. An ally of sorts for the royals would be the clergy. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been one of the greatest pillars of French life and closely tied to the monarchy itself. The two estates that outvoted the third would soon be undermined. In July of 1790, the National Assembly passed the civil constitution of the clergy, bringing the church under the authority of the state. So now, bishops and priests would no longer be appointed by Rome. They would be elected by citizens and paid by the government. Church lands were nationalized, and clergy were required to swear an oath of loyalty to the nation. For many priests, this was an impossible demand. Some accepted the oath, while others refused, believing obedience to the state meant betraying their faith and religious loyalty. De-Christianization had become yet another battlefield of the revolution, and for Marie Antoinette, who considered herself a devout Catholic, It struck at the very foundations of her world and her family's legitimacy. Of course, for the monarchy, the implications were far reaching. If the state could reshape the church, what did that mean for the concept of the divine right of kings that had supported royal succession for centuries? Inside the Tuileries Palace, the royal family, especially the Queen, watched these unprecedented changes with growing alarm. King Louis XVI struggled to navigate the crisis. He was not known for being a decisive, inspiring leader. If there were to be a king who could manage to survive the turning tides of the revolution, it would require qualities he simply did not have. This king was essentially trapped in Paris, surrounded by revolutionary forces and losing authority with each passing reform. He increasingly believed that restoring order would require help from outside of France. To get that help and protect his family, the royals would have to escape Paris. The plan was simple in theory: slip out of the Tuileries Palace, reach the Eastern Front, and secure protection from loyal forces and foreign allies, and eventually return with support to restore order. So, on the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family attempted to do exactly that. They disguised themselves as servants and quietly left the palace under cover of darkness. Marie Antoinette posed as a governess. Louis XVI took on the role of a valet. Their children were dressed in ordinary clothes as they slipped out of Paris and began the journey east. Perhaps this escape was doomed from the start, but it was born out of the king and queen's growing fears about their family's safety as the tension in Paris was becoming unbearable. It seemed like it was a risk that was worth taking. They weren't completely alone, though. They had help from the Queen's friend. If you'll remember, the Swedish nobleman Axel von Fersen, who many accuse of being Louis Charles' real father, he offered 2 lightweight carriages, but the King and Queen had promised never to separate and refused. They chose a single large carriage that moved much slower and had to stop for repairs. That would be just one of many missteps. With poor communication, misunderstandings, and the king talking to people in the small villages along the way, they only made it to the small town of Varennes, just a few dozen miles shy of their royalist allies. It's believed someone recognized the king from seeing his face on French currency and reported it. Revolutionary guards caught up with the family and detained them. News of catching the royal family spread across the country. Within days, the king, queen, and their children were escorted back to Paris under heavy guard and shame. We'll never know what outcome the story might have had if the escape had been successful. What we do know is the failed attempt was a disaster for the monarchy. It dissolved any lingering belief that the king actually supported the revolution. The flight to Varennes confirmed what critics had long claimed, that the monarchy intended to abandon France and return with foreign soldiers to crush the revolution and use against their own people. The king lost what little support he had. They saw him as a coward, a king stealing off in the middle of the night to betray his people. Yet, France attempted one last compromise. Louis XVI formally accepted a new constitution that transformed the country into a constitutional monarchy. Power would no longer rest solely with the crown. Authority would now be shared with an elected legislator, and the king's ability to rule independently was sharply limited. But at least the royals would still have a place in France's future. Publicly, Louis swore loyalty to the Constitution, but the atmosphere remained tense. Many of the more radical revolutionaries did not just doubt the king's sincerity, they believed the old regime had to be removed completely in order to rebuild. They believed the king's mere existence would always be a threat to the revolution, because if enough loyalists gained support, everything they were working towards could be destroyed. Though the Constitution did bring a brief pause to the crisis, but it didn't bring peace. Economic hardships continued, while nobles and clergy were fleeing the country, gathering abroad, and calling for foreign intervention. Inside the Legislative Assembly, political debate grew more and more radical. Among the rising voices was Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer from Arras whose reputation for strict principle had earned him the nickname the Incorruptible. Robespierre was a strict supporter of Enlightenment ideas, like those of Rousseau. But as the revolution intensified, the atmosphere became sharply focused on the survival of the revolution, in his mind, at all cost, based on the virtue that it promised, even force if necessary. In a country increasingly gripped by fear of invasion, rebellion, and betrayal, his uncompromising logic was starting to resonate. He warned that mercy could become indulgence, and indulgence in a revolution could be fatal. For Marie Antoinette, watching from the Tuileries, these hardening voices signaled that any lingering hope for compromise or mercy was starting to fade. For months, those tensions were building across Europe. Foreign monarchies watched the French Revolution with horror as the French people essentially imprisoned their king and were killing their own people. They feared it would be a contagion that could spread to their own thrones. This only amplified when the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria in April of 1792. They swore to defend the revolution from foreign threats, while having their Austrian-born queen basically in captivity. Marie Antoinette's Austrian heritage had always been a source of resentment. Now, her life was in imminent danger. Every military setback and every rumor of conspiracy seemed to confirm what her critics already believed, that Marie Antoinette was a spy, a liability, and an enemy to the people of France. Those fears appeared to be confirmed when the Duke of Brunswick, who was the commander of the combined Austrian and Prussian armies, issued a proclamation threatening Paris with severe retaliation if any harm came to the royal family. The manifesto was meant to protect the king and queen, who were clearly in danger. But to many Parisians, it felt like proof that the monarchy, especially the queen, was aligned with foreign powers threatening the revolution's survival. The Austrian whore was now seen as the puppet master behind the threat of invasion, sealing her image as the ultimate traitor in the eyes of the radical crowds. That would lead to the insurrection of 10 August 1792. Crowds of revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace, home to the royal family and their court. Armed citizens and militant groups surged into the palace grounds in violent, chaotic fighting. The king's Swiss guards were killed by the hundreds, along with a few members of the court. The Tuileries was quickly overrun. Inside the palace, amid the chaos and slaughter, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their children, and what remained of their court fled across the courtyard to seek refuge at the Legislative Assembly. The Assembly suspended the king's authority almost immediately. With that, the royal family was arrested. Now, they would be transferred to the Temple Prison, a grim medieval fortress in Paris. There, they were separated from their household and placed under constant guard. Now, there would be no question. The royal Bourbon family were officially prisoners. Anyone closely associated with them were now in mortal danger as well. By early September, fear and paranoia ran rampant in Paris. France was at war, revolutionary armies were struggling, and Prussian forces were advancing towards the capital. Rumors spread that if the enemy reached the city, prisoners might rise up, join them, and burn Paris to the ground. After all, the prisons were overcrowded with nobles, priests, and suspected hoarders who might join counter-revolutionaries. In response, Georges Danton, one of the revolutionaries' central leaders, called for volunteers to gather. He urged bold action in defense of the revolution, but once panic took hold, the violence spiraled into what became the September massacres. The growing mob began pulling prisoners from their cells and bringing them before improvised tribunals. The so-called proceedings were more like bloody theater than a legal process. In chaotic succession, prisoners were brought out, names read, accusations shouted, and within minutes they were either freed or sent to face the vicious mob of men, women, and children. All across the city, courtyards and prison entrances filled with violence. Once the condemned were handed over, they were cut down with swords, ripped apart, stabbed with pikes, and mutilated as the crowds cheered. The prison staff did not approve of this barbaric process and let many escape, especially women. It was hoped that this next victim could also escape, but she was too well known. It felt like a victory every time the crowd got a notable noble. So, when the queen's own lady-in-waiting, Princess de Lamballe, had her name called, the crowd erupted. She was one of Marie Antoinette's closest and most loyal companions. Now, she was being dragged before an improvised tribunal. She was ordered to renounce the monarchy. When she refused, the crowd killed her. Her head was cut off and carried through the streets of Paris. The mob brought the severed head to the Temple prison, hoping Marie Antoinette would see her friend and recognize her by her blonde hair. Accounts vary. Some say the head was thrust toward the window and she fainted in horror, while others say the guards blocked the view. But the intent was clear, to taunt the queen with her friend's mutilated face. Princess de Lamballe was just one of many. For 4 days, the killings continued. More than 1,000 prisoners were slaughtered this way. It marked a turning point, not just for the revolution, but for Marie Antoinette personally. The blood of her closest friend on the streets outside her prison walls shattered any illusion that she or even her children might be spared. It was terrifying. The revolution had begun in search of liberal democracy and was now enforcing rule with the blood of its own people. Previously, death sentences differed by class, hanging for common criminals or the sword for nobles. As the new ideas of the revolution intensified, the guillotine offered equality in death. The machine was designed to make execution swift, efficient, and consistent. In that uniformity, it also transformed execution into something systematic and detached. Soon after the September massacres, the National Convention formally abolished the monarchy. After more than 1,000 years of kings ruling France, the crown itself was declared obsolete. France would no longer be a kingdom. It was a republic. The following day was proclaimed Year One of the French Republic. Royal titles were stripped away. The king was no longer Louis XVI. In revolutionary language, he became simply Citizen Louis Capet, as they emphasized sameness and the removal of distinctions. From inside of the Temple prison, the royal family, or formal royal family, could do little but wait. If France no longer had a king, what should be done with Louis? What about his wife and his children? Maximilien Robespierre offered a chilling answer. With regret, I pronounce this fatal truth. Louis must die so that the nation may live. Robespierre was arguing that the king didn't even need a trial. His death was necessary for the revolution. Yet not everyone agreed. By the end of 1792, Citizen Louis Capet was put on trial by the National Convention. He was indicted on dozens of charges of high treason. He was brought from the Temple prison to face the charges, and he claimed his innocence. With an overwhelming vote, no one stood for his innocence, and the former king was declared guilty. His fate was more split. Just over half voted for his death. So, on January 20th, Louis was granted a short, final visit with his family. They did not yet know this would be the last time to see him, but the air was thick with dread. It was emotional and filled with tears, embraces, and whispered hopes. Marie Antoinette understood this was likely the last time she would see her husband alive. The former king had asked for a few more days, but that was not to be. The following morning, the guillotine stood in the open square. Crowds gathered to witness the former king answer for his crimes. What they saw was a man in plain clothes, calmly approaching the executioner. Louis mounted the scaffold and addressed the crowd. He proclaimed his innocence, but soon the drums rolled and drowned out his voice. Moments later, he knelt before the guillotine and placed his head under the blade. When it fell, the King of France was dead. His severed head was held up as the crowd chanted, "Long live the Republic." From the nearby Temple prison, Marie Antoinette could hear the gunshot salute that confirmed her fears. Her husband was dead. Louis had been her husband for more than 20 years. Their marriage had begun as awkward teenagers who didn't really know what to do with each other. But over time, they slowly built a deep familial bond, one that was now shattered in an instant. Marie Antoinette would now be known as Widow Capet. She mourned her husband by wearing black and refusing to eat for a time. Her grief was raw and silent, but wouldn't receive any sympathy from her captors. Yet another layer of protection was gone. She was a prisoner of the Republic, left alone to fear greatly for her children's future, which now felt completely uncertain and terrifyingly fragile. With the monarchy out of the way, war and fear continued to spread, so the convention created the Revolutionary Tribunal. What was meant to replace mob violence instead systematized it, with only two outcomes: acquittal or death, which really meant heads would roll. It became a core tool of the Reign of Terror. In addition, the convention created a new body to defend the revolution, the Committee of Public Safety. Its name sounded reassuring, but its powers were far-reaching. The atmosphere escalated to where loyalty was expected to be absolute. Citizens were expected to police each other, report anything suspicious, and not reporting could itself be suspicious. Neighbors watched each other for strange meetings. They reported if someone was suspected of harboring nobles, and even the way you spoke could spark suspicion. Certain words and terms became virtue signals. If someone used old titles like Madame out of habit, it clashed with the revolutionaries' requirement to address everyone as citizen. And that alone could be enough to report. These rigid restrictions, controlled by the government, turned perceptions, rumors, and personal bias into weapons. Ironically, in direct conflict with the Enlightenment ideas the revolution had started with. This social and interpersonal turmoil, I think, is well described in historical fiction novels like In the Reign of Terror by G.A. Henty and The Scarlet Pimpernel by Baroness Orczy. The characters give an idea of what this chaos must have felt like. The extremism clearly needed to be contained, or it would spiral out of control. Yet, as it continued on that path, even its own leaders began to divide. The Girondins called for restraint. The Jacobins argued survival required force. When that divide collapsed, armed crowds surrounded the convention, and the Girondin leaders were arrested. Any hopes of moderation were now removed, and with it, any protection of the royal family. Patriots of the Revolution ordered that Louis Charles, only 8 years old, be taken from Marie Antoinette's care. Louis Charles had once been the Dauphin of France, heir to the throne. After his father's execution, royalists quietly referred to him as Louis XVII, though the Republic, of course, refused to recognize the title and felt like they needed to place him under revolutionary supervision to prevent him from being raised in that mindset. The young boy would be pressured to reject his parents and his former identity, while losing any form of nurturing. Naturally, Marie Antoinette found the separation unbearable. Witnesses recalled her desperate protests and heart-wrenching pleas as guards pried the sobbing child from her arms. She clung to him, begging, but her voice carried no authority. From that day forward, Marie Antoinette would never see her son again. She was left alone in her quarters, completely at the mercy of a revolution that despised her, stripped her of her son, her maternal purpose, and her final fragile hope in the darkness of the temple. Soon, her world would continue to narrow as she was transferred from the temple prison to the conciergerie. The building had become the final stop for prisoners awaiting trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The former queen was now being held alone in a small cell under constant surveillance. Guards watched her day and night, leaving her almost no privacy and no respect. The conditions were harsh: cold floors, dim light, and the constant noise of other prisoners waiting for their own trials. Outside, the rumble of carts carrying the condemned to the guillotine passed regularly, a daily reminder of what her fate may be. But at this point, Marie Antoinette understood what was coming. There was no illusion left that she would be saved. The months of grief, imprisonment, and uncertainty had taken their toll. At 37, the woman who had once set the standard of fashion across Europe was visibly worn down. Her once famous golden hair was now gray. Her health was failing, and her body became frail from sorrow and deprivation. In the meantime, the revolution continued down a path that was growing ever more destructive. The convention declared that terror would be placed on the order of the day. It passed the law of suspects, giving the government sweeping power to arrest anyone believed to oppose the revolution. The definition of guilt was deliberately broad. Anyone suspected of supporting the monarchy could be detained. Across France, prisons filled as local communities compiled lists of those deemed politically anti-revolutionary. Over the following weeks, roughly 2,000 people were killed. They even suspended the constitution, and France was declared revolutionary until peace. Power now rested with the Committee of Public Safety and the Revolutionary Tribunal, not in the hands of the citizens. Those powers would now turn their full attention to the former queen. On October 14, 1793, the widow Capet was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The courtroom was crowded and openly hostile. Spectators packed the gallery to gawk at the trial of the once glamorous queen, now a pale prisoner. More than likely, the verdict was declared long before she ever entered the room. As the trial unfolded, it was clear this was less about justice and more about political theater. Marie Antoinette stood alone to face the charges, conspiring with foreign powers, betraying France to Austria, draining the national treasury, plotting against the Republic, and incest with her son, Louis Charles. At this monstrous accusation, she finally broke her silence. "I appeal to every mother here, whether such a thing is possible." It wasn't just the accusation that caused her distress. It was from knowing that by getting a statement from Louis Charles, that the poor boy was being terribly mistreated and had no one to protect him. His own memories were being rewritten as a nightmare. The trial continued, and without any surprise, the tribunal found her guilty. Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death. In the early hours of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was awakened in her cell. The woman once celebrated as the most glamorous in Europe was preparing for her execution. She was forced to change in front of guards as she dressed in a plain white gown. Her long graying hair was cut short for the blade Parisians had begun to call the national razor. Her hands were bound as she was escorted from her cell to the street. Unlike her husband, who had ridden to his death in a closed carriage, she was placed in an open cart, deliberately exposed to the jeering crowds that lined the streets. The cart carried her slowly to the Place de la Révolution. Witnesses described her sitting upright, composed, and silent. Her face was pale, but her posture unbroken. When the cart stopped, she climbed the scaffold without hesitation. There was no speech. According to the executioner, the same man who had taken her husband's life, he recalled that she had accidentally stepped on his foot. She turned to him and said quietly, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to." Moments later, with all the dignity her royal training could perform, she calmly knelt before the guillotine and took position. The heavy blade fell with a thud. The crowd erupted in cheers. The most hated woman in France was dead. Her body would soon be buried in an unmarked grave. Marie Antoinette's fate was a far cry from a life that had begun in the splendor of Imperial Vienna. Now her children were left to face the whims of the revolution without her. Despite the blame and judgment that marked Marie Antoinette's time as queen, her execution did not bring peace to France. If anything, the violence only intensified. Executions continued across France, and resistance was crushed with increasing brutality. from mass drownings in Nantes to the devastation of Vendée. That violence would soon turn inward. Jean-Paul Marat was already stabbed to death in his bathtub. Georges Danton was executed, and by the summer of 1794, Robespierre himself, the man who had justified terror as necessary, was arrested and executed. With his death, the reign of terror began to collapse. In the aftermath of such death and destruction, an almost forgotten member of the royal family had remained behind inside of the Temple prison. Marie Antoinette's beloved son, Louis Charles, had been held there since his separation from her years earlier. On June 8th of 1795, he died in captivity at just 10 years old. Doctors who examined his body reported signs of severe neglect and illness. Tuberculosis had ravaged him, but it had been worsened by isolation and poor conditions. His sister, Marie Theresa, Madame Royale, was released later that year in a prisoner exchange and sent to Austria. She would live there the rest of her life in exile. The only surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. It would take years for France to stabilize. The country remained weak, plagued by corruption, factionalism, and political intrigue. The next chapter in French history would begin as Napoleon Bonaparte stepped in and essentially end the revolution by ushering in a new era. It wouldn't be until 1815, during the Bourbon Restoration, that Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI's remains were exhumed from their unmarked graves and given a proper royal burial, finally granting them the dignity the revolution had denied. As we know, that famous quote, "Let them eat cake," was written by Rousseau when Marie Antoinette was only a child. It became attributed to her during the Third Republic in the late 1800s. It started as satire, but into the 20th century, books, movies, and popular culture solidified her image as the ultimate symbol of greed and excess. A narrative that has since been ingrained in the public zeitgeist to this day. From Maria Antonia of Austria to the Queen of France to Widow Capet, Marie Antoinette always seemed to stand as the symbol of something. So perhaps the cruelest irony is that even in death, she's remembered for something she never said. This was True Crime of the Historical Kind. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your patience, as I haven't been able to post as regularly as I want. I am trying, I promise. But don't worry, I'll be back with more episodes soon. Make sure you're following and maybe even share with someone who you think might like this podcast. Until next time, bye.